Continuing from our discussion on the wisdom traditions that preceded the Sophists, we now turn our attention to these figures themselves, exploring their complex position within the shifting social and political landscapes of classical Greece, particularly the interplay between aristocracy and democracy. So, what's the backdrop? Think ancient Greece, generally. It's a culture obsessed with standing out, with getting noticed. We call this the agonistic spirit, basically. Everyone's always competing. Not just in the Olympics or on the battlefield, but in art, music, philosophy. You name it. If you could show off your skills, your arete, that's the Greek word for excellence or virtue, often meaning skill or capability, then you were onto something. This drive pushed people to write plays, compose poems, anything that could be performed or read widely, hoping to impress peers and posterity. Now the Sophists? They were the ultimate performers in this intellectual arena. They weren't just thinkers. They were showmen, dazzling audiences with their Sophia, wisdom but also cleverness, skill. They blended the flair of poets, the gravitas of prophets, and the perceived wisdom of statesmen. Crucially, they took prose, which had been overshadowed by poetry and music, and made it a powerful persuasive force. They became the go-to guys for public speaking, the teachers of rhetoric. And this wasn't just a passing fad. By the late 5th century BCE, there was a real boom in demand for this kind of training. People with time and money wanted to learn how to wield Sophie effectively. This whole phenomenon is what we call the Sophistic movement, a major shakeup in how education paideia was understood. Now, here's where it gets interesting. While the Sophists thrived in democratic Athens, we can't just slap a democratic label on them. Why? Because this whole idea of competing to show off your best stuff, your arete, that's fundamentally aristocratic. It's about proving you belong to the aristoi, the best guys, the elite. Think of it like winning a prestigious award. It signals you're among the top tier. And this demonstrated excellence could serve any system, whether it's a democracy, an oligarchy, or even a tyranny where the ruler claims ultimate superiority. Athens, though, was the undisputed king of competitive arenas. You had formal festivals for sports, music, drama, but also constant political jostling, vying for office, winning court cases, debating policies. Behind all this public posturing were intricate social networks, where the aspiring climbed the ladder by associating with those already recognized as excellent and influential. The Sophists, then, were educators for anyone wanting to climb that ladder, regardless of the political system, democratic, aristocratic, whatever. But their biggest market, Athenian politics, especially during its peak democratic phase. Let's zoom in on education itself. Before the Sophists really took off, higher learning wasn't for everyone. Basic reading, writing, math, physical training, music, sure. But the fancy stuff, the real refinement, that was the domain of the wealthy, the landowners, the oligarchs, the heads of powerful families. These were the aristoi, the best folks, who set themselves apart with both money and talent, often showing off their skills in competitions. Their status was supposed to be inherited, like family land, but it wasn't guaranteed. Each generation had to prove it, through competition, and by ensuring the next generation was just as good. So, educating young men wasn't just about knowledge, it was about maintaining the privilege of the class. Elementary stuff could be handled by tutors or even slaves, but the real deal, the higher education shaping a young man for adulthood, had to come from respected elders within the class he aimed to join. The poet Theognis put it perfectly when advising his young protege. Hang out with good people, eat and drink with them, you'll learn noble things from noble men. Bad company, though, you'll destroy your good judgment. Where did this happen? Often at the symposium, these intimate dinner parties where conversation, wit, and song were key displays of arete. Herodotus gives us a fantastic example of this aristocratic education in action, set in the early 6th century. Meet Cleisthenes, tyrant of Sicyon. He wants to marry off his daughter, Agariste, and he's looking for the best Greek guy around. How does he find him? He throws a massive year-long audition. After winning an Olympic chariot race, he invites suitors from all over Greece. For a whole year they stay in his house. What does he test them on? Everything. First their pedigree, obviously. Then their manliness, their temper, their education, their manners. Younger guys get taken to the gymnasium. But the real kicker, the final boss level, was dinner. Herodotus says it was a competition in music and in conversing in company. Imagine the pressure. One suitor, Hippocleides, famously messed up, got too drunk, started singing badly, disqualified himself. The winner was Megacles, who went on to father some seriously important Athenians. The lesson? In these elite circles, you needed to be witty, talented, composed, and able to hold your own under pressure, especially when the wine was flowing. This kind of thing wasn't just a one-off. Athens, especially under the Pisistratiid tyrants, became a major hub for these intellectual and artistic gatherings. The Pisistratiid family, particularly Hipparchus, brother of the main tyrant Hippias, was known for starring big poetry contests. Now, here's a fun bit from a dialogue supposedly featuring Socrates. Hipparchus is portrayed as doing this because he wanted to educate the citizens. His reasoning? Since he was so good and noble, kalos to Agathos, it would be wrong to deny wisdom Sophia to anyone. Okay, maybe that's a bit of a spin, likely reflecting later democratic sentiments. But it shows the Pisistratids were definitely trying to cultivate an appreciation for elite culture among a broader audience, even if it started from a position of power. Fast forward a bit, towards the end of the 6th century. The game starts changing. Those skills, persuasive speech, winning grace, clever conversation, they're no longer just for aristocratic salons. They become super valuable in the wider world, especially as Athenian democracy starts to heat up. Take Themistocles, the famous admiral. Plutarch tells us he was ambitious, wanted to be number one, despite his family background not being top shelf. He was rich enough for high office, but apparently lacked the musical flair expected of him. So, what does he do? He hires a famous citharist Epicles to play at his house, drawing in other influential people. Smart move. But even more crucially, Plutarch claims Themistocles got tutoring in rhetoric, what was called Sophia back then, but basically meant political cleverness and practical wisdom. His tutor? Mnesiphilus, a local politician, a family friend, someone aligned with Themistocles' populist leanings. Interestingly, Mnesiphilus was also targeted for ostracism later. This shows the transition. The old ways of climbing the ladder through aristocratic connections are starting to blend with hiring experts, like the Sophists, for political advantage. The Persian Wars really changed the game. Defeating Xerxes wasn't just a military victory, it reshaped society and politics across Greece, creating a huge demand for Sophia, both among the old aristocracy and in the burgeoning democratic forums. Athens, now the dominant naval power and economic engine, felt this most acutely. But it wasn't just Athens. Places like Thessaly and Thebes, whose aristocrats had sided with Persia, faced crises. Despite these changes, leadership in Athens stayed firmly in the hands of the established elite for decades. Think Cimon, son of Miltiades, the marathon hero. Plutarch paints him as a classic aristocrat, charming at symposia, praised for his cleverness and military skill, embodying the agathos aner, the good man, through his accomplishments and generosity funded by his wealth. Then there's Pericles, Simon's rival. He followed a path similar to Themistocles and Hipparchus, associating with the biggest names in philosophy and cosmology of the day, Zeno, Protagoras, especially Anaxagoras. Plato even credits this circle with polishing Pericles' natural-speaking talents. He also hung out with Athenian experts in politics, music, prophecy, and sculpture. And let's not forget Aspasia, his wife, a woman of considerable intellectual standing who caused quite a stir. This whole scene highlights the incredible intellectual buzz in mid-5th century Athens. These gatherings, like Pericles, weren't entirely new. They echoed long-standing aristocratic traditions, hosting guests, xenoi or philoi, friends, bonding over shared interests, enhancing reputations by association. Young men joining these circles, like Ion with Cimon or Socrates with Zeno and Parmenides, were essentially being initiated into the exclusive club of their future peers. But here's the twist. While connections still mattered, they weren't the only ticket to the top anymore. Especially in Athens, during the 5th century, money was increasingly becoming a factor in social mobility. And this brings us to the Sophists. So, what fueled this rise of the Sophists? A huge factor was the changing economy in Athens, particularly under Pericles. Money, lots of it, was flowing into the city coffers thanks to the empire. This wasn't just abstract wealth, it was tangible silver coinage. This money funded the massive Athenian navy, sure, but it also started shaking up the social order. Pericles championed using this wealth for the people, paying citizens for public service, funding grand building projects. Suddenly, more people had access to personal wealth, which destabilized the old hierarchies and cranked up the competition for status at the top. Families realized they needed to give their sons an edge, and one way was to introduce them to the intellectual culture favored by the leading Athenians, and guess who was ready to teach that culture? Exactly, those with means started offering money for tutelage. Think of it as hiring a personal coach for the mind. And who were the coaches? Increasingly, the Sophists, names like Protagoras, Zeno, Ion, Damon, Thrasymachus, they were the celebrities of the intellectual world. Aristophanes, the comedian, skewered this trend in his plays, like Banqueters and the Famous Clouds, showing how young Athenians were supposedly being brainwashed by these teachers. But what were they actually teaching? A whole lot: poetry, ethics, how the universe works, math, and crucially, the principles of logical argument and debate practice. The goal? To sharpen critical thinking, to be able to argue convincingly on any topic, and ultimately, to be recognized as one of the kaloi kagathoi, the beautiful and the good, the self-proclaimed elite. And the demand was sky-high. Plato's dialogues, set in the 420s, confirm this. In the Laches, prominent Athenians discuss whether a rite can be taught to their sons. Socrates admits he always wanted to find such instruction for himself, but never could afford the fees. He specifically mentions the Sophists as the only ones claiming to make him kalos kagathos. Plato's portrayal, like Aristophanes, shows Sophists as profiting significantly from teaching the young. Hippias, another sophist, boasts about his earnings in Plato's Hippias Major. He talks about Gorgias making a fortune giving demonstrations to the young, and Prodicus making astonishing amounts of money. He claims sophists earn more than craftsmen from their craft. Hippias even drops some numbers: 150 minas from a trip to Sicily, 20 minas from a small town. Other sources mention fees ranging from a whopping 100 minas for the big names like Protagoras, Zeno, and Gorgias, down to 5 minas for others. Even public lectures had a price tag, like Prodicus charging 50 drachmas per talk. Now, were these figures exaggerated? Maybe at the very top. But considering a modest house cost 3 to 5 minas and a fancy one 20 to 30 minas, these were serious sums. Personal instruction was definitely a luxury, but clearly, enough wealthy Athenians were willing to pay for it. Even if you couldn't afford private lessons, people were still fascinated by the public performances of the Sophists. Hippias, in Plato's Lesser Hippias, bragged about his Olympic speeches as competitive events where he could claim superiority on any subject. The real high-stakes verbal contests, of course, happened in the law courts and the assembly, where arguments could literally mean life or death, or determine the fate of the city. Thucydides gives us a prime example in his account of Cleon's speech against punishing the Mytileneans too harshly. Cleon rips into his opponents, accusing them of wanting to make the worse argument defeat the better. He laments that speakers prioritize winning over sound judgment, and he directly attacks his audience. You have become regular speechgoers. Any novelty in argument deceives you at once. You are completely at the mercy of the pleasure of listening, and are more like spectators gathered around sophists than those deliberating affairs of state. Ouch! Cleon's point is that this fascination with dazzling rhetoric, regardless of substance, was becoming widespread. So, what was the point of all this sophistic education? Pericles, in his famous funeral oration, aimed to elevate all Athenians, encouraging everyone to embrace the city's intellectual and aesthetic achievements. Athens was meant to be the Pedusis, the education of Hellas. This fostered a reputation for Athenians as the smartest, the most innovative. Naturally, young Athenians steeped in these values were motivated to prove their cleverness. The Sophists offered a pathway to intellectual arete, excellence of the mind for those who could pay. Isocrates, for instance, recalled his father spending a fortune on his education specifically to make him more conspicuous and more distinguished among his peers. It was still about achieving arete, but now through new forms of discourse and intellectual refinement. Where did this intellectual arete get showcased? The gymnasium was for physical prowess, but the symposium, held in the androns, the men's dining rooms, was the place for displaying mental agility and winning social esteem. Aristophanes pokes fun at this in his play Wasps. The dad character, Philocleon, loses a court case to his sophisticated son, Delicleon. To cheer him up, the son promises to take him everywhere, including the symposium, to avoid demagogues. It's a funny reversal. The son then tries to tutor his dad on how to act among well-informed and clever men, advising him to tell stories and join in singing contests. The dad, of course, is clueless about the intellectual niceties and excels at the rowdy, indulgent side of the symposium. Aristophanes is mocking both the boorish dad and the affected son, reflecting the real social world where fathers sought out sophists to make their sons witty and learned, knowing that wit and learning were the currency of arete in these circles. These peer groups, formed around dining couches, were crucial. These were your philoi, your friends, allies, the people you could count on for support in politics or lawsuits. Your standing within these groups was key to your career. Plato's Protagoras promised young men that his course would lead to the greatest influence in the affairs of state. How? One major tactic was turning any discussion into a debate, an heuristic contest, where the goal was to win by refuting opponents, laying logical traps. It was described as agonistike, the athletics of debate. The ideal sophist, according to Plato, was antilogikos, a master of disputation, capable of arguing against anything. This focus on winning arguments, regardless of the topic's importance, became a target for criticism, like Cleon's rebuke and Aristophanes' portrayal of Strepsiades in Clouds, who wants to learn hair-splitting argument to cheat his creditors. But let's be fair. While pure verbal sparring could seem pointless, the ability to speak persuasively had real value, especially in courtrooms and political assemblies. So, it's no surprise that these skills were highly valued in the philoi circles, where members might face legal battles or aspire to public office. By the time the Peloponnesian War broke out, being a skilled speaker was arguably the most recognized prize offered by sophistic training. Protagoras was famous for his ability to make clever speakers. Later, Gorgias arrived, promising instruction in rhetoric to persuade jurors, counselors, assembly members, anyone in a political gathering. He was hugely influential, teaching many, and even claimed students like Critias and Alcibiades. His fame spread beyond Athens. However, this association with figures like Critias and Alcibiades, who were seen as prioritizing personal power over democratic principles, contributed to the growing suspicion and dislike of the Sophists among the Athenian populace. Antiphon provides another stark example. He was an Athenian sophist, known for both teaching rhetoric and writing speeches. But he's also infamous as the mastermind behind the plot to overthrow the democracy and establish the oligarchy of the 400 in 411 BCE, right after the disastrous Sicilian expedition. This plot hatched in secret political clubs called hetairai, which were tighter knit than mere philoi groups and known for radical action. Thucydides describes Antiphon as extremely forceful in thought and speech, someone sought after for advice on winning arguments in court or the assembly, despite avoiding public debate himself. After the oligarchy collapsed, Antiphon was tried and executed. This dark chapter cemented the image of the sophist as a potential enemy of the demos. So, looking back, what did people remember most about the Sophists? Primarily, they were teachers of persuasive speaking. That's how Aristophanes portrayed them, how Thucydides referred to them, how Plato represented them. While their teachings covered a lot more, human nature, ethics, language, all relevant to living in a polis, the focus on rhetoric was undeniable because political life revolved around speech. But this education was exclusive, limited to the wealthy kaloi kagathoi who wanted to stand apart from the demos. Figures like Cleon readily denounced them as charlatans or worse, secret plotters against democracy. The events of the 420s and 410s, with sophists frequenting circles that turned into anti-democratic conspiracies, only fueled this distrust. Especially after the failed oligarchy, sophists were persona non grata among politicians loyal to the demos. This suspicion is vividly captured in Plato's Meno. Socrates asks Anytus, a leading democratic politician, where his Thessalian friend Meno should go to learn arete, virtue or excellence. Socrates suggests consulting those who teach arete for a fee, the sophists. Anytus explodes, "By Heracles, no one I care for should consort with those people. They are manifestly the disgrace and ruin of those who keep their company." Instead, Anytus argues, any good Athenian would make Meno better. This reflects a core democratic belief in the innate nobility of Athenians, echoing Pericles' vision of Athenian identity as inherently virtuous, rooted in a shared understanding of justice and the common good, something Protagoras had explored in his myth about human creation. But that vision was shattered by war. As Thucydides puts it, war is a violent teacher, eroding trust and pushing societies towards factionalism and violence. Athens suffered defeat, endured the brutal oligarchy of the 30, who enforced a harsh definition of Athenianness. Recovering from this trauma, the Athenians re-established democracy with a renewed focus on defining and safeguarding Athenian identity. This led to stricter citizenship laws and efforts to reinforce collective piety. In this climate, the legacy of sophistic teaching, with its emphasis on argument and potentially relativistic views, looked problematic. The very concept of Sophia needed redefining. This brings us to the trial of Socrates, happening just 4 years after democracy was restored. It's widely seen as partly motivated by the need to purge the perceived negative influence of sophistic teaching. Anytus and his fellow prosecutors likely saw prosecuting Socrates, a man deeply connected to sophistic circles, some of whom had opposed the demos, as a way to burnish their own democratic credentials. Socrates, or his followers, had to distance himself, claiming a life dedicated to seeking Sophia and arete for himself, never pretending to teach others, and crucially, never taking payment for it. Teaching for pay was for them the defining characteristic of a sophist. Socrates was convicted, partly for allegedly corrupting the youth under alien influence, specifically, not believing in the gods the Athenians believed in. Plato's writings, especially the Apology and his dialogues, are widely interpreted as a defense of Socrates against the Sophists, drawing a clear line between the two and absolving Socrates of the Sophists' ill repute. So what's the takeaway? The drive for arete, for excellence, remained strong in educated Greek culture. But the arenas shifted. The tumultuous experiences of Athenian democracy, with thousands participating in government, raised the general level of political awareness. People had witnessed the cutthroat competition in the assembly and courts, and they'd seen playwrights dissect rhetoric for laughs or tears. Rhetorical skill became commonplace among the political elite, even as they warned against deception. Success required study, but you had to present it as innate talent, because being called a sophist or a speechwriter was an insult. Yet, even Gorgias, still active in the 4th century, received public honors at Olympia for training the soul for contests of arete. His student, Isocrates, condemned the excesses of the sophists, but defended his own art as a practical form of philosophy. Professional speechwriters like Lysias and Isaias were teaching rhetorical techniques. Paths were diverging. Plato and others were paving the way for a more reflective, intellectual arete, focused on inner harmony and meaningful living, tackling ethical questions about justice and human nature. Isocrates, meanwhile, offered instruction for a more active, politically engaged life. But the underlying agonistic spirit, the competitive drive to achieve and demonstrate intellectual excellence, continued to fuel both the sophists and their intellectual heirs. And that, in essence, captures the complex legacy of the sophists. They were products of their time, navigating the currents of aristocratic tradition and democratic innovation, leaving a lasting impact on Greek thought and culture, even as they became controversial figures. Thank you.